During the medieval period in England, many notorious and feared men came onto the throne and ruled with brutality. It was an age in which women did not rule in their own right, and the medieval period was marked by civil war, rebellions, and chaos during many of the king's reigns. For example, King Richard II, the young king who tried to put down the peasants' revolt, and he was successful in this, but is also known for being one of the worst kings ever to rule. There was also King Edward I, who, despite being known for being a good and strong king, was a ruthless man who became known as the Hammer of the Scots for good reason. During the following centuries, after the deaths of the medieval rulers, their coffins and burial vaults have all been disturbed inside of Westminster Abbey and other churches across the land. Some people were morbidly curious as to what the remains of a king looked like 500 years after their deaths, but others had more sinister intentions in mind when they broke into these graves. But what are these vaults like today? In this video, we look specifically inside the medieval royal burial vaults, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. For his height, Edward I was sometimes referred to as Edward Longshanks, and he was always destined to become the king. He was the oldest son of King Henry III, and he married at a young age Eleanor of Castile, a well-thought-of European princess. As a prince, he began to command armies, and he made a significant number of enemies inside of Wales and Scotland, and he was someone who was trusted by his soldiers and forces. His father, the king, allowed him to rampage and fight the enemies of the English on his behalf, and Edward I was crowned king on the 19th of August 1274 inside of Westminster Abbey following his father's death. As a prince, many believed that Edward was someone who would not have been fit for king, and some believed at the time that he would become a tyrant due to his ruthless nature and his violent attacks upon his enemies, but he was someone who took the role and job of king seriously, and he was loyal to those around him, and he continued to hone his craft as a military commander and leader. Those around him believed he was very good-looking and tough, and he was fit for the job, but he became a more patient man who was devoted to religion, and he also accepted the Council of Parliament in helping him rule. He was, by all accounts, the perfect king for medieval England, strong, intelligent, and level-headed. However, he would expand the power and influence of England through his conquests to the west and also the north. He attacked Wales and almost brought the country to its knees, invading and blockading the Welsh forces, which led to them surrendering. He besieged Welsh towns and castles and forces that the Welsh would accept him as their ruler, and he would for years later ruthlessly put down Welsh rebellions and uprising against the English. He even had one of his sons born there, his eldest, who then took on the title of the Prince of Wales, and this is still a tradition today. But Edward I would also shatter the peace established between England and the Scots, and he rampaged across the border and wanted more land and power inside of the northern country, which he believed was a vassal state to England. He wanted Scotland to fund England and be answerable to the English crown, and he was given influence inside of the nations, as he even managed to choose a puppet king to rule over Scotland. But in battles and campaigns against William Wallace and his troops, Edward became known, and he would get his own back on Wallace, who was regarded as a rebel, having him brought to London, where he was then tried as a traitor and was then in front of a huge crowd hanged, drawn and quartered. By the year 1306, Edward I was a very elderly man, and he had lived a long life by the standards of medieval England. Healthcare was virtually non-existent, despite the fact he was king. But Edward was becoming very ill. He would spend a large amount of money on importing foreign medicines and potions that he believed would treat him, and also importing leggings from Europe to help deal with problems from his legs. Edward I would also be kept inside of a neck brace, and he probably suffered with arthritis and joint pain. To relieve this, the king took regular herbal baths also, but whilst travelling towards Scotland for one more military campaign, he was taken gravely ill. The king wanted to destroy the Scots once and for all, but on the 6th of July 1307, at Borough by Sands in the north of England, King Edward I was resting inside of his tent. The next morning his servants tried to wake him up, and as they then entered the tent, they knew something was wrong. They lifted Edward's body and he felt cold and limp, and in the evening he had died. A number of rumours that emerged about what happened to his remains, and one of these was that his heart was cut out and was taken to the Holy Lands to be used by crusaders as a holy relic. And there were other rumours that his bones were to be taken every time armies travelled into Scotland to fight the Scots for good luck as a relic, but the reality was that Edward I's body was sent south, and it took many days to get back towards London. It arrived in Waltham Abbey in Essex, and lay in state there, and in the September of 1307 his funeral was being prepared. It was then the following month that his body was moved to the monastery of the Holy Trinity, before it finally got to St Paul's Cathedral in London, ready for the funeral procession. Edward I's body arrived at Westminster Abbey on the 26th of October 1307, and the funeral ceremony was large, and the king was buried inside of his coffin, which was lead-lined. He was inside of the coffin wearing his coronation robes, and this included a cloth of gold, lower garments, and also a red silk tunic. He was very much buried in his best clothes. On Edward I's head was a crown, and in his hands were the sceptres of office, and he was placed inside of a plain black Purbeck marble tomb. There was no effigy created of Edward, despite the fact inside of Westminster Abbey many of the earlier kings' tombs have effigies on them, and this is still the case. But in the years following Edward I's death, a number of stories did come around about the state of his remains and burials. Some believed that the tomb was a temporary resting site, only as a plan was, according to his wishes, for Edward's corpse to be boiled down and then taken on crusades to fight alongside crusaders in the Holy Land. The tomb and coffin were opened many times throughout the following centuries, and what was discovered was shocking. The first time the coffin was opened was roughly 70 years after his death. It was stated inside the records that, to the treasurer and chamberlains, order of the king's money to renew the wax about the body of King Edward I, buried in the church of St Peter, Westminster, as used hereforto to be done. What this meant was that the coffin was opened for the remains of Edward to be rewrapped in wax and cerecloth, the heavy, thick, protective cloth his body was shrouded in to preserve it. This would have been an expensive process, but was aimed at keeping the king's remains in a good state by renewing the wax around it. It's possible that his remains were completely recapped, rather than just extra wax being placed on it. However, this is doubtful due to the next time the coffin was opened, the king's remains were found in a remarkable condition. In 1774, over 400 years since the death of Edward I, the coffin was opened yet again, but what was found this time was that the state of his remains were brilliant, considering that he had died such a long time ago. It was written about this that the chin and lips were entire, but without any beard, and a sinking or dip between the chin and underlip was very conspicuous. Both the lips were prominent, the nose short, as if shrunk, but the apertures of the nostrils were visible. There was an unusual fall or cavity on the part of the bridge of the nose which separates the orbits of the eyes, and some globular substance, possibly fleshly part of the eyeballs, was movable in their sockets under the envelope. It was said, on lifting up the lid of the tomb, the royal body was found wrapped in a strong and thick linen cloth, waxed on the inside. The head and face were covered with sudarium, or face cloth of crimson, sarcenet wrapped to 3 folds, comfortable to the napkin used by our Saviour in ways to his crucifixion. On flinging open the external mantle, the corpse was discovered in all the signs of majesty richly habited. The body was wrapped in a fine linen cerecloth, closely fitted to every part of the body, even to the very fingertips and face. the writs ordering the renewal of the waxen covering of the body of Edward I, being extant, gave rise to this search. Over the cerecloth was a tunic of red silk damask. Above that a stole of thick white tissue crossed the breast. On this, at 6 inches distance from each other, quarterfollis of figris, work of gilt metal set with stones, imitating rubies, sapphires, amethysts, and to the intervals between the quatrefoils on the stole, powdered within minutes white beads, tracked down into the most elegant embroidery, in form not unlike what is called the true lover's knot. The king's clothes that he had been buried in were still shimmering, and was said that above these habits was the royal mantle of rich crimson satin, fastened on the left shoulder with a magnificent fibula of gilt metal richly chased, and ornamental with 4 pieces of red and 4 of blue transparent paste, 24 more pearls. The corpse from the waist downwards was covered with a rich cloth of figured gold, which fell down on the feet and was tucked beneath them. On the back of each hand was a quarterfoil like those on the stole. In the king's right hand was a sceptre, with a cross of copper gilt and an elegant workmanship reaching to the right shoulder. In the left hand was the rod and dove, which passed over the shoulders and reached to the ear. The dove stood on a bull placed on the 3 ranges of oak leaves of enamelled green. The dove was white enamel. On the head was a crown chased with trefoils made of gilt metal. The head itself was lodged in the cavity of the stone coffin, always observable in those receptacle of the dead. The corpse was dressed in conformity with ancient usage, even as early as the time of Saxon Sebit. Despite the fact that Edward I had been buried in a rather plain tomb, there had been very successful attempts to preserve his body and remains inside of Westminster Abbey, and his body was said to have been in a brilliant state because of this. It was not expected for it to be in this way, but Edward's body had been protected well. He was a warrior king and was probably one of the greatest kings that England had ever had. For 400 years following his death, his face was still recognisable. King Henry III was born on the 1st of October 1207 in the city of Winchester, and he was the son of King John, a man who is often considered to have been the worst king of England. But his nation was ruled by a number of regency councils, and Henry III did not take over until the year 1234. He was just 9 years old when his father died, and the country was under the control of rebel barons led by Prince Louis, the son of the French king. Eventually, the expulsion of 2 ambitious Frenchmen who would dominate the council led to Henry taking control himself. A few years into his rule, there was a significant number of problems, and the barons objected to Henry's relatives, and marriage was arranged in 1238 between Henry's sister and a prominent English nobleman, Simon de Montfort, and this led to more problems with the barons. In 1242, Henry's half-brothers went on a disastrous campaign to France, which cost a lot of money, but Henry III tried to get the better of his barons. He was a very unpopular king, and he was threatened with excommunication by the Pope, and he also lost a number of battles in Wales, and problems were arising all over England. Decisions were made to then hold a parliament 3 times a year, and there would be significant reform in the households of the kings and queen, but things broke down further as barons argued, and the Earl of Gloucester and Simon de Montfort went to battle, and civil war broke out. Simon de Montfort was victorious, and he established a new government, but Henry III's oldest son escaped from prison, and he rallied and eventually managed to kill de Montfort before taking control of the government from his significantly weaker father. Simon de Montfort's death was avenged by the king, and he tried to be harsh towards other rebels. However, he was very short of money. His son Edward left for crusade in 1270, but then Henry III became very ill. He was worried about a new rebellion that was growing, and he asked his son to come back to England, but Edward refused to do so. Henry did recover a little, but he never got his full strength back, and on the 16th of November 1272 he died at Westminster with his wife in attendance by his bedside. Henry III had requested to be buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and specifically in front of the church's high altar, and in the former resting place of Edward the Confessor. Henry was a devoted worshipper at the shrine of St Edward the Confessor, and he had reconstructed Westminster Abbey significantly. He expressed previously to be buried inside of Temple Church in London, but later changed his mind. Whilst work was being done inside of the church for the king and for his grand tomb, he was laid to rest inside the former grave of Edward the Confessor. He wanted his tomb to be like the throne of a saint, and he thought that his body would hold different relics. Henry III was reburied inside of his new tomb in 1290, and this was constructed by his son, Edward I, north of the Confessor's shrine. The image of him in bronze on the tomb was added 2 years later. However, there was a number of reports that miracles began to occur at the tomb. The oak coffin of Henry III, which measured 1.87 metres long, was lowered into place with chains, and these chains were then left inside of the elaborate tomb, and the coffin was covered with cloth of gold. But following his death, his heart had been cut out, and his visceral remains were also placed inside of separate vessels. These were, to begin with, placed inside of the tomb, but in 1292 the heart of Henry III was removed from the tomb and was taken to Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou to rest with the bodies of the Angevin kings. His tomb is large and significant, and the metal place on which the king's effigy is on top of also has pillows beneath the head of the king. The effigy is actually hollow, as it was incredibly heavy and once a canopy over the tomb, but this has since gone. There were jewels on the crown and robe of the effigy too, but these have also been taken, as the sceptre which was in his hands. Further damage occurred to the lions that were at his feet. The inscription on the tomb states, "Here lies Henry, formerly King of England, Lord of Ireland and Duke of Aquitaine, son of King John, formerly King of England, to whom God grant mercy. Amen." But over the centuries, inside of Westminster Abbey, many of the tombs and royal sites of burial, including the burial vaults, were opened. For example, Mary Queen of Scots' burial contained many remains of the Stuart royal family, and this was said to have been crammed full with coffins and other burials. In fact, the sight when the vault was opened was said to have been terrible. With the tombs of the medieval kings and their queens scattered at the heart of the abbey, near to the shrine of Edward the Confessor, these were also over time opened, and many of the bodies inside were even inspected inside of the coffins. Following his interment, an inscription was added to the tomb during the 16th century. However, Henry III's tomb was opened and examined in 1871. It was said that the coffin was over 6 foot in length and made from polished oak, and it was incredibly heavy, and it took 9 men using pulleys and their strength to expose the coffin inside. They struggled to open the effigy, but when they did open it, they made the decision not to open the coffin of Henry III. It's not known why, bearing in mind that years earlier, many of the other kings, such as Edward I, had their coffins opened, and even their remains peered at for the first time in centuries. There may have been no reason to justify the opening of the coffin, but still today, Henry III's coffin has not been opened. Henry III was not one of the greatest kings of England. He was someone whose reign was dominated by warring barons who all fought for their power and influence and their right to dominate the country of England. He was a weak king, but he spent huge amounts of money on Westminster Abbey, expanding it. He spent foolishly, in this regard, roughly £15 million in today's money, and he was more bothered about religious devotion and being remembered as a saint than he was actually helping people inside of England and ruling effectively. But still, today, Henry III is buried inside of his tomb at the heart of Westminster Abbey. He is believed to have been one of the worst kings ever to rule over England, and King John's reign over his nation was one which was categorised by losses of land, and by rebellion. He was the king who was forced to sign the Magna Carta, and he was a man who was suspicious and vengeful. He was a man who had a large knowledge of his country. However, inside of Newark Castle, on the 19th of October 1216, at the age of 49, King John died. He was described as someone who was distasteful and even dangerous, as well as a man who was very cruel. However, over the centuries, the king's coffin, following its burial, was broken into, and what those people saw was incredible. King John, initially it's believed, would never really become king. He was seen as the spare during his father, Henry II's reign. He was his father's favourite son. However, in 1189, his brother Richard succeeded to the throne, becoming Richard I. However, John would later become the heir to his brother's throne. It was in 1199 when John became king and war with France began again, and this was triggered by the second marriage of John. He was asked to mediate between a dispute between two rival families, but John actually married the heiress of the Angoulême family, Isabella, who had been betrothed to the rival family. A rebellion broke out and John was ordered to appear in front of the French king, and when he did not do this, war broke out between England and France. But by 1206, King John had lost large amounts of French territory, including Normandy and Anjou. He was losing the war heavily, and he was determined to win his lands back. But this was cost, and his government raised taxes across England, and the king exploited his feudal rights over his population more, and the taxes went up heavily, and people were furious because of this. There was a lot of discontent within the barons, and negotiations between the king and his barons failed, and civil war broke out in the May of 1215. The rebels seized London, and John was forced to negotiate, and this concluded on the 19th of June at Runnymede on the River Thames, when John accepted the terms of the Magna Carta. This charter limited the royal power and ensured that feudal rights, and it was the first formal document stating that the king was under the rule of law, as was his people, and that the king was not above the law. King John claimed that this would be signed under duress, and the Pope took his side, and John in anger laid waste to the north and the Scottish borders with his army. Prince Louis of France was then to invade at the request of the barons, but John continued to wage war. In the September of 1216, he began a fresh attack, and he marched from the Cotswolds to relieve Windsor Castle, and he attacked many settlements. However, in Lynn, John contracted dysentery, and this would later become fatal. There were further invasions in England, and John, when he was heading west, lost much of his baggage train, and the king's belongings, including the crown jewels, were lost as John crossed one of the tidal estuaries into the Walsh, and it's claimed that these may have even been sucked in by quicksand. But this incident has never been confirmed. However, John was becoming very ill. He stopped to rest inside of the abbey in Swine's Head in the Lincolnshire Fens. However, he managed to make his way to Newark Castle, which was a short distance away. There was debate as to whether John was poisoned inside of the abbey by one of the monks or the abbot, who did not want to host the king. John ate the food and drank with the monks. However, inside of Newark Castle, it was clear to many that the king was very ill. John met his end inside of a toilet in Newark Castle in the October of 1216. He died from dysentery, which was a very terrible disease that causes serious diarrhoea and would then result in death. There were rumours that he was killed by eating too many unripe peaches, which poisoned him and made him sick, or that he drank too much ale. It was then claimed by a historian that to say John died of overindulgence was a way of criticising his personality. It implies impertinence, gluttony, and imprudence. To say he was poisoned showed he was hated. Whatever the truth, those writing down history had nothing to say about John. Dysentery is caused by parasites in the gut, and it's most commonly spread by consuming dirty water or food that have been contaminated with human waste. It was not necessarily a condition of the common people who lived in unsanitary conditions, as lots of food and vegetables had been grown in soil which was fertilised by human waste. John could have contracted this in a manner of ways, drinking contaminated water when he rampaged across the country. Following John's death, his body was embalmed by the abbot of Croxton Abbey in Leicestershire, and his internal organs were then buried there. Nothing remains of this site today. However, it's known that John's heart was placed in a gold vessel and buried elsewhere, and that his coffin was trapezoidal stone coffin, and with a round head cavity, and that it was initially buried in the floor of the Lady Chapel of Worcester Cathedral. However, John's body was then disturbed, and it was moved to the high altar of the cathedral in 1232, and an effigy was carved out of the original coffin lid, and this was placed on top of the tomb. The tomb was then reburied as a table tomb in 1529. The body at this point was said to have been wrapped in gold and silver cloth and had different royal regalia. However, the coffin of King John may have been desecrated and disturbed during the English Civil War. It's known for certain that John's coffin was opened in the July of 1797, and that during this it was found, when the body was moved to begin with, the cranium of John had been turned a strange way, and that this caused damage. Both of the jaw bones had broken away, and they were found next to the right elbow, and also a leg bone had been stolen. But what was also found out was that the king's burial was very different to even other medieval kings and queens. Many medieval monarchs were buried with great pomp and ceremony, and were dressed in their state robes, signalling their importance. However, King John, when he was placed in the coffin, was buried wearing a simple monk's habit, which included a cowl, and this had been tied under his chin. This could have been for a number of reasons, from the fact it was the only clothes that the abbot who embalmed him had in his possession, or even that John requested this as he had been treated well by monks previously when he was fed, and that he may have also wanted to be buried in monk's robes to signal his piety and religious devotion. But this may have also been done by John to almost apologise to God for his actions, bringing civil war to his nation that resulted in the deaths of many. When the coffin of John was opened, it was said the monk's robes were preserved rather well, and that his skeleton had been preserved well by them. The investigators also stated that no flesh had been found on his body. However, it was said that there was a number of maggots found in the coffin, meaning that the preservation of John's body and the embalming had not been hugely successful, with these creatures feasting on the remains of the worst English king's corpse. King John was one of the worst kings ever to rule over England, but in his death his remains were buried a number of times, and his coffin was broken into. What those who opened the coffin found was the remains of a king who were buried almost in the same way that a high-ranking monk would be. It was not a royal burial, but one which was low-key for a man who many believed would never have been entitled to be buried alongside other monarchs inside of Westminster Abbey. Henry V, throughout his early life, probably never expected to become the king, but his father, Henry IV, did manage to depose his cousin, Richard II. After his father was exiled, Richard II actually took the future Henry V into his custody and treated him well, but when his father came back to usurp Richard II, Henry then embarked in a career in the armed forces. He was commanding much of the English army, and he led forces against the Welsh, and he helped stave off the troops of Henry Hotspur Percy during the Battle of Shrewsbury. But at the age of 16, Prince Henry was almost killed as he was shot in his left cheekbone by an arrow. He was given the best care, and a wound that would have usually killed ordinary soldiers got better. He was treated with honey as an antiseptic, and he managed to extract dirt from the wound and was left with scars, but he did recover well. Henry continued to fight on against the Welsh, but he became the king on the 20th of March 1413 and was crowned weeks later at Westminster Abbey on the 9th of April. There was a huge snowstorm during this, and people in England thought it was a bad omen. Henry was a very tall man, and he was said to have had eyes flashed from the mildness of a dove to the brilliance of lions. And, as king, he worked on a number of changes to England, and he dealt with former rivals well and gave everyone a clean state. When he was encountering danger, he dealt with it well, showing that he was a competent and a good leader. He also ordered the use of English in his government rather than Old English and French, and he wrote in English. But with regards to his problems in France, with the 100 Years' War raging on, he needed to show his strength on the battlefield. Henry's best known for the Battle of Agincourt, in which he led the English army to a spectacular victory against the French. He was given the promise of the French throne after the death of the French king, and was made the heir to the French throne. The brilliant work he did for the English against the French during the 100 Years' War would later be undone in the years after his death. However, on his deathbed he claimed that he wanted to live longer to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. The warrior king wanted to embark on a final crusade to the Holy Land. On the 31st of August 1422, whilst at the Château de Vaucancy in France, Henry V died. He was 35 years old, and it's believed that he died from dysentery, which he caught in the days after the siege of Meaux. He quickly succumbed to his death, and some historians claimed that he died from a different condition, or a disease such as smallpox. In France at the time, it was incredibly hot in the summer months, and Henry V was riding around in a full set of armour, and he caught a terrible fever, probably caused by heat stroke. However, he never got better. He would spend some time being carried around by those who attended on him, as he was so weak, and he could not mount his horse as he was so weak. He was then waited on for a few more weeks, and then he succumbed to his death. He had ruled over England for only 9 years, and despite being considered one of the greatest kings, he only ruled for a brief period, unlike some of his predecessors. He also never met his successor, King Henry VI, who was just a very young baby when he took the throne of England and also France. The body of the English king was then taken across the English Channel, and his brother brought the remains back to his capital. It had rested inside a ruined cathedral for some time, and the funeral procession was massive as the coffin was taken from Dover to St. Paul's Cathedral. On top of his coffin was Henry V's life-sized effigy, which showed the king with a crown on his head and a sceptre of power in his hand. His coffin was taken to Westminster Abbey on the 7th of November 1422 for his funeral and his burial. It was a huge spectacle, and horses carried the king's coffin into Westminster Abbey on a chariot. Money was given by Henry V for a chantry chapel to be erected over his coffin and tomb following his interment, and the tomb was a large one too. It had a significant inscription around the side that reads, "Henry V, Hammer of the Gauls lies here." Henry was put in the urn 1422. Virtue conquers all. The fair Catherine finally joined her husband, 1437, flee idleness. On top of the tomb is a lifelike effigy of the king, which is made from silver, and other symbols are found on the tomb, as well as a lion resting at his feet, showing his power, that the most powerful of animals were under Henry V's feet. Some of the items used in the funeral procession, such as a shield and a helmet, have been stood the test of time and can be seen inside of Westminster Abbey today. However, there was a huge discovery made in 1953 regarding the tomb of King Henry V. For over 500 years his tomb and coffin had been sealed and had not been opened, with Henry being one of the few kings who was not disturbed in their coffins and tombs. But in the 20th century, the decision was made to try and open the tomb, and is not recorded as for the reason for the investigation. His tomb was opened, and he had some work done on his tomb in the years following. However, it claimed that during the investigation work regarding his tomb, the remains of another man may have been discovered as sharing a tomb with the former English king. A small hole in the floor of the base of the northern turret of Henry V's chantry was discovered, and there was a cavity underneath. With this, the excavation of the remains of a man of 6 foot in height was found in a stone-lined grave along with a crozier and a gold ring. The grave had been disturbed when the chantry was built, and these remains belonged to the Bishop of Norwich and close friend of Henry V, Richard Courtenay. Courtenay had been with Henry V in France and had died of illness at the siege of Harfleur, but then Henry V had his remains repatriated back to Westminster Abbey, and he was buried next to, if not within, the same tomb as Henry V. He was a trusted friend and adviser to Henry V, hence why he ordered his remains to be interred in the place that the king had probably outlined for his own burial. Some have considered why Henry V and Richard Courtenay were buried very close to each other. Some historians have speculated if there could be anything more than friends. However, this is unlikely. The bishop had died years before Henry V, and he had been laid to rest in a grave right next to where Henry V was buried, and the floor in the base of the chantry discovered Courtenay's remains. There was nothing inside of Henry V's testament and will that he would be buried with anyone. It was assumed that his wife would be laid to rest alongside him, but this never occurred, and Catherine of Valois' remains were actually subjected to a harrowing amount of defilement over a period of 400 years. But Henry V was a warrior king, and he was someone who for many years wanted to conquer France, and he would succeed in his determination to be made the heir to the French king. His son, Henry VI, did succeed him as the King of France and England, but he would be very young, and he never lived up to his father's high kingly standards. But in the years following, Henry V's reputation is one of being a brilliant yet ruthless king. But the mystery about the burial of one of his closest friends practically under his tomb is one that is less known about than his stunning victory at Agincourt. One of the forgotten medieval kings of England was Henry IV, a king who took the throne deposing Richard II. His actions later led to the Wars of the Roses as the houses of Lancaster and York would fight for the crown. But throughout his reign, Henry encountered a number of problems and rebellions, including the serious one involving Henry Percy or Henry Hotspur. But the king then became very ill, and he, in 1413, died at the age of 45, and was succeeded by his son, the remarkable Henry V, who would win some incredible battles against the French, including the Battle of Agincourt. But there was a lot of mystery behind the king's death and also his burial. But the king's coffin was opened a number of times, and what they found was remarkable. Henry Bolingbroke, as he was known at birth, was born in the April of 1367 inside of Bolingbroke Castle. But he was the son of John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III. Gaunt was a very powerful and wealthy knight and politician, and Henry's mother was Blanche of Lancaster. But the king at the time was Richard II, and Henry got involved in rebellions against the king, but he escaped punishment despite a number of other rebellious barons being executed or sent to exile. Henry then spent a year supporting a siege in Europe, but he became a feared and powerful military leader and commander. And he also went on to pilgrimage the Holy Land, and he wanted to later free Jerusalem, but he did not achieve this. But his relationship with the king was strained, and Henry was banished from the kingdom. In the February of 1399, his father, John of Gaunt, died. But Richard II did not allow Henry to inherit his father's vast wealth and land, but rebellion would then emerge. Henry then met with another exiled man, Thomas Arundel, who was the former Archbishop of Canterbury. They planned a return to England when Richard II was in Ireland campaigning, and Henry then attacked, leading a military campaign, taking land from those who did not support him, and he told his soldiers to raze much of Cheshire to the ground. The claim that he wanted to reclaim his rights as the Duke of Lancaster, but he gained so much support he could then have himself proclaimed King Henry IV.
and he then managed to even imprison King Richard II, with him then being starved to death in prison. Henry IV was crowned and coronated on the 13th of October 1399 inside of Westminster Abbey, and the new king then months later put down a rebellion aimed to assassinate him. He knew his reign would be difficult, and he spent much of his time on the throne defending himself from attack. His first major problem was to deal with the deposed Richard, and it's believed, as mentioned, he was killed upon the orders of Henry IV, who saw him as a significant threat to the new throne. It's believed that Richard did not suffer a violent death, as his skeleton showed no signs of violence when looked at, but his body was then placed on public display to dispel rumours that the new King Henry had killed him. There were further rebellions, including the revolt of Owen Glendower, who claimed he was the Prince of Wales, and he managed to put these down, as well as rebellions by a renowned knight, Henry Hotspur. Henry IV's eldest son during the battle with Hotspur was wounded by an arrow to the face, but as time passed, more rebellion emerged. Also, in the final years of his life, Henry suffered a number of serious health issues, which included a skin disease, and he also suffered very serious bouts of illness in the early 1400s. He paid for the best doctor to be with him at all times, and some have claimed that his skin disease may have been leprosy or maybe psoriasis or something else. Others have said his health problems were caused by epilepsy or heart disease, but what led to the king's death is debated. It was predicted that Henry would die inside of Jerusalem, but he died inside the Jerusalem chamber in the abbot's house of Westminster Abbey on the 20th of March 1413. But Henry IV and his wife Joan were not buried at Westminster Abbey, but instead Canterbury Cathedral on the north side of the Trinity Chapel, opposite to the shrine of Thomas Becket. This may have been due to the devotion Henry IV had to the cult of Becket that emerged following his violent death. There was a bizarre story that emerged about his body after death, and that was when Henry's body was taken between Barking and Gravesend that a violent storm hit the ship carrying it, and the sailors, believing Henry's remains were used, then allegedly threw it overboard as they believed it brought bad luck. But this is unlikely, as a 19th century investigation took place to look into the coffin of Henry IV and his tomb. The tomb was surrounded by iron railings inside of Canterbury and was decorated with effigies of the king and his wife. However, because of the doubts about the actual location of Henry IV's body, there was an investigation ordered that took place on the 21st of August 1832. This was done to check whether a body was actually inside of the royal coffin. As the workers opened the tomb, a rough wooden coffin was found lying 2/3 under the west end of the king's monument. On top of the rough coffin was a simple lead coffin made from 2 sheets of lead. This coffin was not opened, but the investigators believed that this belonged to Henry IV's wife, Queen Joan. They then turned their attention to another coffin, and the lid was then sawn off of this, and inside was a lead coffin. This contained the body of King Henry IV. A small cutout was made so they could have a look at the king's body, and it was found that he had been very well embalmed, and shockingly it was discovered that his effigy was incredibly lifelike, which had been placed on the tomb. 5 layers of leather wrapping was peeled back, and underneath this was the king's face. The leather was still firm and moist, meaning there was still protecting Henry IV's body as well, centuries on. The lower parts of his face were perfectly preserved during the examination. The nose shriveled, but the bearded chin was said to have been moist, and the eyeballs could even be felt when someone reached in to feel the face. After this, the wrapping was then replaced and the coffin was resealed, and it was confirmed that these were Henry's remains. What came after the death of King Henry IV would be a civil war which would grip England as the Wars of the Roses emerged, with the House of York and the House of Lancaster fighting for supremacy over the nation. Henry IV was seen by some as a usurper, but he destabilised Richard II as a king who is often considered to have been one of the worst. Henry reigned for a period of around 14 years, and he suffered in his final days with disease and illness. But his burial was one which was different, being interred in Canterbury rather than Westminster Abbey. But what those people found who opened his coffin was the remains of a well-preserved king buried 400 years previously.
One of the most notorious kings to reign over England was King Richard III. He's been portrayed throughout the centuries as a man who murdered his nephews so he could take the throne himself in a huge power grab during the Wars of the Roses. Richard's reign did not last long, as within 2 years of his crowning he would be lying dead on the battlefield, being slaughtered by the forces of his enemy, Henry Tudor. Richard's story has been one which has been muddled with legend. However, the true facts about his brutal death were uncovered when his remains were discovered under a car park in Leicester in 2013. But what is showed the world was that the last Plantagenet king of England died a horrifically barbaric death on the battlefield, and he suffered a number of earth-shattering wounds, particularly one which was fatal on the back of his skull. But what happened when the grave was opened and when the king's bones were discovered? Richard III was crowned king on the 6th of July 1483 inside of Westminster Abbey, and the Wars of the Roses had for decades gripped England. He was a king who had publicly denounced the princes in the Tower, his nephews, of whom one, King Edward V, was the rightful king of England. The two boys, Edward V and his brother Richard, were held inside the Tower of London, awaiting their coronation, when they disappeared, and many believed that Richard III, who seized the throne, was responsible for their murder and disappearance. However, Henry VII, or Henry Tudor as he was known, met Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in August of 1485, and this would be considered the last, if not one of the final battles of the Wars of the Roses, the English Civil War that had gripped the nation for decades, fought between the House of York and Lancaster. Richard had a much larger army, and facing him was Henry Tudor's forces, but also watching the proceedings was Lord Stanley, who led 6,000 men and mercenary soldiers who would later become the pivotal part of the battle. His support would change the tides of English history forever, and he would turn on his support for Richard III and support his stepson, Henry Tudor, and his forces waded in at the final part of the battle. It was claimed in the final minutes of the battle that Richard III fought in the thickest presses of his enemies, and that he in fact met a very brave demise and death. The king's men could smell victory, and they wanted to bring the battle to a close and death with Henry Tudor himself. The king and a number of his men rode bravely towards Henry Tudor, who was being guarded by some bodyguards, and Richard, being a skilled military commander, smashed his way through the guards of Henry Tudor, and he personally killed the Tudor standard-bearer. He was fighting hand to hand, but at some point, whilst he was in boggy, marshy ground, Richard III was unhorsed and he came stuck. He had allegedly come within a sword's length of Henry Tudor, his enemy, but Richard found himself then overwhelmed by Lord Stanley's forces and soldiers. His horse had got stuck in the muddy terrain, and it was claimed that Richard was struggling in the mud and that the death blow was struck by a Welshman with a halberd whilst Richard's horse was stuck, and it was said that the blow was so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. It was alleged that specifically the man who killed Richard III was a Welshman called Rhys ap Thomas, who even shaved part of the king's skull when he struck him hard with his weapon. It was claimed that Richard fought very bravely, and it was also said that he fell in the field struck by many mortal wounds, and that they beat his head until his brains came out with blood, and they never left him until he was dead. Following this, the body of Richard III was stripped naked and was then paraded throughout the streets to Leicester, where it was placed on display for a number of days. For Henry VII, as he was now known, it was important for Richard's body to be seen, as the people of England needed to get the message about his death.
But following the display of the dead king's remains, Richard's body was hastily buried inside the priory of the Great Friars inside of Leicester. In 1495, Henry VII commissioned an alabaster memorial to mark the site of Richard's burial, but the abbey was then demolished during the dissolution of the monasteries. There were many debates as to what happened to the remains of Richard III, including a very strong rumour, even told to me as a child, that his remains were thrown into the River Soar in Leicester. There were even plaques created around the city marking where it was believed his remains were thrown in the river off the bridges. However, this was not true. In 2013, one of the discoveries of the century was made, as the former site of the Grey Friars was located in the car park of a Leicester Council building, and then remarkably, a skeleton was found with battle wounds on it. Eventually, this skeleton was confirmed via DNA to have been that of King Richard III, over 500 years after his death. But the discovery of his body showed a barbaric and brutal death that the king suffered on the battlefield, and the true account of his death could be pieced together. Richard suffered 11 wounds on his skeleton, and 8 of these were to his skull. These had been sustained in the battle, and it alluded to the fact that the king lost his helmet during the last parts of the battle, and with this an attack was launched towards the king. There was more than one person using different weaponry that attacked Richard, and he also suffered a V-shaped cut along the bottom right part of his lower jaw, and his face was also cut by a knife or a dagger. Another cut on his lower jaw had also been made. But the body of Richard III was well protected, leading to the conclusion that he was wearing significant armour, which was effective, and he had little injury to his torso, meaning he was still wearing his armour when he was killed. There was another wound on the left above his ear and on top of his skull, but the wound that was fatal was brutal. 3 glancing blows caused by a sharp-bladed weapon, such as a sword, also caused further misery. But there was also a small piercing hole in the king's skull caused by a roundel dagger being driven into his skull, and this could have caused brain damage. The fatal wound was at the base of the skull, and this was a huge wound that showed a very powerful weapon, such as a bill or a halberd that struck Richard III at the side of his head and had smashed through the top of his vertebrae, shattering his neck. This had even sliced through his brain, and this would have been a wound that would have stopped anyone in their tracks, and he would never have recovered from this. It is likely that this could have killed Richard III instantly, and this is corroborated in the sources as being the wound inflicted by the Welshman with his halberd. Because of this allowed the historians to tell the story of the final moments of King Richard III's life over 500 years ago. Richard must have been in trouble following being unhorsed and stuck in the mud, and he then may have lost his helmet or have taken it off in an attempt to dive towards his enemy. He was thought left very vulnerable, and his enemies then jumped on him, and he was surrounded by the best armed medieval soldiers who were skilled with their weapons. His own men tried their best to fight for him and defend him, but Lord Stanley's forces waded in and overwhelmed Richard III and inflicted many different wounds upon him. But then the crushing blow from the halberd came, stopping the kin there and then killing him and bringing the Plantagenet dynasty to an end. Following the end of the battle, the king's face was not heavily disfigured further, so that his body could be identified, and so the people in Leicester could see that their king was dead. Richard III was buried inside of a plain coffin, and over the centuries this had decayed, and the coffin was not found when Richard's body was, meaning that it had just left Richard's skeletal remains in the ground. But what the death of Richard III brought was the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, a ruling family who would for the next century change the face of England forever. We consider Henry VII's defeat of Richard III as something that stabilised England following the Wars of the Roses. However, his dynasty would bring the execution of queens, thousands of people across the land, and a huge amount of religious turmoil.
Edward IV was born on the 28th of April 1442 inside of France, and his father was Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, who led the House of York's claim to the English throne. His father helped to begin with the Wars of Roses, fighting against the Lancastrians, and this began when Edward was a teenager, and his father was killed during the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, and Edward then inherited his father's claim to the English throne. With the help of the Earl of Warwick, a man known as the Kingmaker, Edward fought against King Henry VI's armies, and he would defeat the Lancastrians in a number of battles, including the devastating Battle of Towton in 1461. Following this, Henry VI was overthrown, and Edward IV was crowned the King of England by the right of conquest. However, the Earl of Warwick thought that he could now be the true power behind the king, and he would eventually turn on Edward due to the fury he had about the king's marriage with Elizabeth Woodville. Warwick thought that he was being pushed aside, and that he then, along with Edward IV's brother George Plantagenet, picked up the fight against Edward. He was briefly deposed in 1471, but then returned to the throne, and following this he had Henry VI put to death inside the Tower of London. Edward's second reign was more peaceful and secure, and he raised money from the estates he gained to pay for governmental projects, and he did not need much money from Parliament, and only called them a minimal amount of times. Further treaties helped to develop trade in England, and councils were established to help keep control up north and also keep the area near to Wales safe. In his final years, Edward IV's health began to fail and go downhill. His doctors ordered a huge amount of medicine to treat him, but Edward did not have the healthiest lifestyle. He became very ill in the Easter of 1483, but succumbed to his death on the 9th of April 1483. The cause of his death was not known. At the time, some believed he had been poisoned by enemies, but some claim that he died of a disease such as malaria or even pneumonia. He chose to be buried inside of St. George's Chapel at Windsor, which he had expanded and developed, and specifically he was interred inside of a burial vault near to the high altar. A huge monument was planned to mark the site of Edward IV's burial, and this would have shown the king in an effigy form, but the work for this was never carried out, and today Edward's burial vault and site is marked by a simple black marble slab. The burial vault was important when the chapel was renovated, and one of the pillars of it supports an arch above, but the vault itself is roughly 3 meters long, and it is 1.4 meters wide and roughly this height. This means it isn't tall or big and is roughly 2 meters beneath the floor of the chapel. King Edward IV's coffin was interred inside of this vault on the 19th of April 1483, and later the coffin of his wife was placed inside of here too. The tomb of the king which stood was damaged heavily during the Commonwealth following the English Civil War, and it would then later be reconstructed slightly in the late 18th century. However, for some time, the burial vault of Edward IV seemingly was lost, especially the entrance to it, and many people tried their best to search for it. In 1788, people inside of St. George's Chapel searched for the entrance to the vault from the choir, making holes in the floor, but then in the following March there was repair work being carried out on the floor, and with this the burial vault of Edward IV was discovered and found. What was discovered was shocking. There was desecration and destruction which occurred inside of the burial vault. It was found that the remains of Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen, had been terribly treated. Someone had entered the vault, broken up her coffin and taken her remains out, and the bones had been scattered all over the vault, and they were actually mixed into the rubble and brick, which were found also in the vault. Her skull was even found, and the bones of the queen were scattered everywhere. It's not known who did this. Could have been done following the Civil War with the desecration of the tomb monument, or maybe someone took it upon themselves to treat the remains of Elizabeth Woodville terribly. Her reputation throughout the centuries did have a significant amount of damage. Under all of the rubble, the coffin of King Edward IV was found, and this was said to have been rather undamaged and in a good condition. This was then opened, and despite the king's body being embalmed, it was in a rather bad way. The skeletal remains of Edward IV were discovered, and there was no soft tissue preserved on his skeleton, but it was found inside of the coffin that some of the king's long brown hair had fallen off of his skull, and the king's hair was then found, but inside of the coffin it was discovered that a significant amount of liquid was inside of the bottom of the coffin, and the feet and lower legs of Edward IV were submerged in this, and this would not have helped the preservation over the centuries. The coffin of King Edward IV was then secured shut after the inspection of his remains, and the burial vault was then sealed. It's not known what happened to the remains of Elizabeth Woodville, Edward's queen. They may have been gathered and placed inside of a new coffin or a vessel, but they may have also just been left as they were. Interestingly, opposite Edward IV, inside of St George's Chapel, is the nemesis of the king, Henry VI, the man who many believed actually was put to death by Edward and murdered inside the Tower of London. Other monarchs buried nearby, inside of St George's Chapel, include Henry VIII, the notorious six-wifed Tudor monarch, and King Charles I, the executed King of England. King Edward IV was the Yorkist king, a man who took the throne by rights of conquest after inheriting his father's claim to the throne. He was someone who later brought stability to the crown after a period which was plagued with battles and bloodshed. He died at the age of 40 and was buried in a chapel that he preferred rather than Westminster Abbey, and he was interred close to his nemesis, Henry VI. He is considered one of the victors of the Wars of the Roses, but the House of York would be deposed 2 years after his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field. When his coffin was opened, there was very little left of Edward IV. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Thank you.